The eminent execution of Lance C Shockley for the cold-blooded murder of Sergeant Carl Dewayne Grah, Jr. inside the Potosí Correctional Center. What will be Missouri's first execution by 2025 has begun. Lance Shockley is scheduled to be executed in Missouri, will be executed by lethal injection on October 14, 2025, at 6:00 p.m. for the 2005 murder of a police officer. After the jury could not reach a decision, the judge imposed the death penalty. The Missouri Supreme Court last week issued an execution warrant for Lance Shockley, who recently exhausted his state and federal appeals and was convicted of the 2005 murder of Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant Carl Dewayne Grah, Jr. His crime? The cold-blooded murder of a Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant Carl Dewayne Grah, Jr. But the deeper you dig, the less certain it all becomes. Because this isn't just a story about a man who killed a trooper. It's a story about power, politics, and the price of a single decision. A decision made not by a jury, but by one judge acting alone. And tonight, as the clock ticks toward Shockley's final breath, Missouri stands divided. Is it justice, or is it another irreversible mistake? Please like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. A trooper's final investigation. Van Buren, Missouri. A quiet rural town, population barely 800. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and bad news travels faster than the current river that cuts through the Ozarks. On the evening of November 26, 2004, Lance Colin Shockley and his sister-in-law's fiancé, Jeffrey Bayless, went for a drive in Bayless's truck, and both men got into an accident near Van Buren, Missouri. Crashed a pickup truck belonging to his sister-in-law's fiancé into a ditch. The accident caused the death of Bayless, and Shockley, who survived the crash, fled the scene. Shockley left the truck to seek help for Bayless, slumped over in the passenger seat. Shockley stumbled to a nearby home, where the owners called 911 and he called his wife. Highway patrol officers soon arrived at the scene of the accident, where they found the injured passenger and several bottles of alcohol inside the truck. Shockley's wife, her sister, and the homeowners were outside, but there was no sign of Shockley. The investigations of the car accident were headed by Sergeant Carl Dewayne Grah, Jr. of the Missouri State Highway Patrol. Shockley was named a suspect behind the incident. During investigations, the police recovered beer cans and a tequila bottle inside the truck, and a blood smear above the passenger side wheel, well on the outside of the truck. Sergeant Carl Graham, a dedicated trooper, a father, a man respected by all Carter County officers. But on March 20, 2005, something about that day didn't sit right. Graham had been investigating a fatal car crash, one that happened just weeks earlier. The driver? Lance Shockley, a 28-year-old local mechanic with a reputation for drinking and driving. Shockley's passenger had died that night, and Shockley had fled the scene. Now, SGT Graham was closing in on him, preparing to file felony charges for leaving the scene of a fatal accident. What happened next would change Missouri law enforcement forever. Around 5:30 p.m., a neighbor saw Graham pull into his long gravel driveway. His house sat just off Highway 60, surrounded by woods and silence. Minutes later, 3 gunshots echoed through the trees. Just when he returned home from his patrol shift, Sergeant Graham, then a 12-year veteran of the Missouri State Highway Patrol, was shot by an assailant with a rifle. The killer was none other than Shockley himself, who likely perpetuated the shooting to stop the investigation. After Sergeant Graham had identified him as the prime suspect behind the accident and Bayless's death, which had been classified as involuntary manslaughter, Sergeant Graham was shot in the back with a high-powered rifle, penetrating his Kevlar vest. The bullet severed his spinal cord at the neck, leaving him immediately paralyzed. The killer then approached Graham, who was still alive, and shot him twice more with a shotgun, in the face and shoulder. By the time police arrived, SGT Graham was dead, shot multiple times beside his patrol car. His service weapon still holstered. No struggle, no warning, just ambush. Autopsy results showed that of all the gunshot wounds found on the victim, one of the bullets was fired from behind Sergeant Graham and severed his spinal cord at the neck. Another 2 gunshot wounds were inflicted into the face and shoulder. In between the first gunshot and the other 2 gunshots, Sergeant Graham had fallen onto the ground, sustaining fractures to his skull and ribs upon impact with the pavement. Graham had been investigating Shockley's role in a fatal drunk driving accident, which the prosecution argued gave Shockley the motive to kill him. Shockley has insisted he's innocent. 3 days later, on March 23, 2005, police arrested Shockley, not as a suspect in the investigator's killing, but for fleeing the scene of the car accident. They soon charged Shockley with both crimes, however, and he was only prosecuted for murder. Shockley was convicted and sentenced to death. The investigation begins. The murder of a state trooper sends shockwaves through any community, but in a small town like Van Buren, it's an earthquake. The Missouri State Highway Patrol mobilized every available officer. Roads were blocked. Drones searched the forest. The governor demanded answers. Who would ambush a cop in his own driveway? Detectives quickly connected one name, Lance Shockley. Why? Because SGT Graham had been investigating him. Because the 2 men had clashed just days before the murder. And because when Graham was killed, Shockley had no solid alibi. The theory was simple, almost too simple. Prosecutors claimed Shockley, terrified of facing felony charges, decided to eliminate the man investigating him. But as the case unfolded, the evidence began to show cracks. There were no eyewitnesses, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon. Only circumstantial links, a borrowed car matching a vague description seen near the scene, and bullets said to be consistent with a rifle Shockley once owned. It wasn't much, but for prosecutors, it was enough to build a story. And sometimes, in small-town justice, a story can be more powerful than the truth. The arrest. Within weeks, Shockley was arrested, charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. He pleaded not guilty, claiming he had nothing to do with SGT Graham's death. He told investigators he was being framed, that the real killer was still out there. But Missouri prosecutors were determined to make an example. Killing a state trooper is one of the most serious crimes imaginable in law enforcement, and they weren't going to let the case go cold. The community wanted closure. And closure, in this case, meant someone had to die. 2009, 4 years after the murder. The trial begins. The courtroom is packed. Local reporters fill every seat. On one side, the family of SGT Graham, mourning, dignified, and resolute. On the other, Lance Shockley, 32 years old, hands cuffed, eyes empty. Over 10 days, the prosecution built their case. The motive, revenge. The means, a rifle. The opportunity, Graham's driveway. The defense countered with one argument. No proof. No direct evidence tied Shockley to the murder. But the jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. Then came the punishment phase. And this is where the story takes a dark turn. In Missouri, a death sentence requires unanimous agreement from the jury, but Shockley's jury couldn't decide. They were deadlocked. Half believed he deserved death. Half didn't. In almost every other state, that would mean life without parole. But not in Missouri, not in Carter County. Here, the decision was passed to one man, the judge. And that judge chose death. It was 2009 when the gavel fell for the last time. Lance Shockley was sentenced to die by lethal injection. Not by a jury of his peers, but by a single hand holding a pen. And from that moment, Missouri joined a haunting statistic, one of only 2 states in America where a judge can unilaterally decide who lives and who dies. Years passed. Appeals came and went. Judges retired. Lawyers moved on. But Lance Shockley remained, locked away in Potosí Correctional Center, waiting for 16 years. Until the day came when his last appeal was denied, and his execution date was finally set. The warrant of execution from the Supreme Court of Missouri reads as follows. Now on this day, appellant, Lance C. Shockley, being in custody pursuant to a sentence of death heretofore, rendered against him by the Circuit Court of Carter County, and affirmed by this court, it is therefore considered, ordered, and adjudged by this court, that Lance C. Shockley be and remain in the custody of the Department of Corrections, and thereafter, within the 24-hour period beginning at 6 p.m. on October 14, 2025, under the supervision and direction of the director of said department, shall suffer death. Said director is directed to make return of this warrant to this court, showing the time, mode, and manner in which this warrant was executed. Appeals. On April 30, 2013, 4 years after Lance Shockley was condemned to death row, his first appeal was filed to the Missouri Supreme Court. On August 14, 2013, the Missouri Supreme Court rejected his appeal against his death sentence. On July 10, 2017, Circuit Judge Kelly Parker turned down Shockley's post-conviction appeal against his death sentence. Subsequently, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected 2 appeals from Shockley in 2014 and 2016, respectively. The Missouri Supreme Court heard another appeal from Shockley in 2018, before the court dismissed it on April 16, 2019, upholding both his death sentence and murder conviction. On March 31, 2025, Shockley's final appeal was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court. On the same date, Shockley's final appeal was dismissed. A motion was filed to the Missouri Supreme Court to schedule an execution date for Shockley. Background and current life. Lance Shockley is the father of 2 loving adult daughters who visit and call him regularly. He is deeply committed to his faith, his family, and his community. He is a religious leader, counselor, and peacemaker. A man trusted by those around him to diffuse tense situations and be an example of moral justice.